Premier Smith, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Listen, I want to begin, oddly enough, with the United States, because even though it's the territorial and the provincial premiers coming together, there was talk about being prepared for any outcome with the U.S. election. How do you think Canada needs to prepare, if at all?
Well, I can tell you everybody's very worried about the Buy America approach that we're seeing under the current Biden administration and the threat of having new taxes put on imports under a Trump administration. We think that our best approach is to make sure that we're demonstrating to the Americans that we are their best friend and trading partner, that we have a mutual agreement and mutual benefit from the cross-border trade, and that we recognize that one of the things that is a priority for the U.S. is that we meet our NATO commitment of 2% spending. So we wanted to encourage the federal government to go in that direction and propose ways that they would be able to meet that strategic imperative, but also help us to build economic infrastructure, because we don't want to see the trade relationship disrupted in any way.
Well, let's talk about that, because it was interesting to hear the Premier's address at the closing news conference, where you need to almost be a bit more creative or wide-minded to think about how you define defense spending and investment, because you could, the argument was made, tied to infrastructure. Could you talk about that?
Well, certainly. I mean, in Alberta, not only do we have the Edmonton Army Base, but we also have the Cold Lake Air Force Base, and we also have Suffield down in my riding in Brooks Medicine Hat. And so we have developed an attraction of a number of different aerospace and defense companies, and I've been told that by developing that economy, that might also work towards our NATO commitment. If you talk to our northern friends, and that includes those Manitoba, which has a northern maritime border, but also our territories, they need to build strategic infrastructure to get their products to market. So they need ports, they need roads, they need rail, they need better air service. And that will help their economies, but it'll also help them to develop critical minerals, which are essential elements in being able to meet some of the requirements, not only for batteries, but also for defense spending. And so we're just encouraging the federal government to think more broadly about how they can have a dual purpose. So build infrastructure that is able to help us domestically, but also be used towards our NATO commitment, and also train up our Canadian Armed Forces. Our Armed Forces did a tremendous job last year helping us all fight forest fires. So why not make that a dual role, hiring and bringing and recruiting more people into the Armed Forces, knowing that they can be deployed in emergency situations, of which we seem to be having more of, but then that would also serve the purpose of being able to meet our NATO goals as well. So I think everybody is committed to trying to find ways to help the federal government do that.
Do you think the current timeline set out by Ottawa is enough?
We'll have to see. I mean, I think to see that the federal government went into the NATO discussions without having a target and came out with one, I think that tells you the kind of pressure that is being put on Canada. We're being singled out, we're being named and shamed, and I think that there was no choice but for the federal government to set a target. Now, I think it's up to us to try to find ways that we can assist them in accelerating it. I would far rather see the federal government invest in strategic infrastructure, helping us build out our communities, build out some of that export enhancing infrastructure, and also being able to meet their international targets. I think that's important for Canada. It's important for us to support our trade partners, and this is important for us to support our NATO partners.
Now, around the table, you also talked about the future of energy. And interestingly, the affirmation that Canada can provide the world with, I think the wording around it was ethically produced and dependable energy. How important was that for you, for your province, to have your territorial and provincial counterparts to essentially affirm that message?
Oh, it's just acknowledging the reality that we are the one nation that contributes the most to America when it comes to their import needs for energy. And we'd like to see that continue to grow. Our eastern counterparts, they see it slightly differently because they also have transmission lines that run north-south. And so Manitoba and Quebec have a really important relationship with their U.S. counterparts in providing secure supply of electricity. We're building out the hydrogen economy, and that is going to be increasingly important, I think, to both of our economies. So I think that we're seeing it from different lenses. And what I appreciated, and this is what I always appreciate about the COF table, is that we find those areas areas of mutual agreement so that we can have a joint statement. So I think it's going to be very important. What I hear from the Americans, of course, is they're concerned about energy security. Even the Biden administration talks about maybe we should get our oil from Venezuela, maybe we should get it from Iran, and we say we're right here. We are your best friend, best trading partner. All we need to have is more pipeline infrastructure. And then similarly, I think the Republican administration, they're very concerned about energy security, and I think we would have a very constructive conversation with them as well.
In addition, the issues were raised about the clean energy regulations,
Yes.
clean electricity regulations, emissions caps.
Yeah.
But when you look at the working document communique, it's immediately followed by concerns about climate change, if you will, and natural disasters. So if Ottawa looks at the criticism of those policies, they could also point, could they not, to the fact that this is all tied to climate change.
What I think the premiers are beginning to see is we tried a carbon tax. We tried a retail carbon tax to see if it would reduce emissions. And in point of fact, it hasn't. The things that have been successful in reducing emissions are things like we've done in Alberta, converting from coal to natural gas. That reduced emissions 53%. Having methane rules so that we were capturing methane from venting. That reduced emissions 45%. It's going to be the big investments from large companies who are producing large amounts of emissions with new technology to do abatement. That's what's going to make a real difference. And then using those technologies and exporting them to the world. We're talking right now with the federal government about how we might be able to create a pathway to participate in the markets in South Korea and Japan because they're seeking ammonia. They want to be able to do dual combustion, have ammonia and coal at the same time to bring emissions down. We know with LNG export, it will have that same effect of displacing global emissions. We know that developing out our hydrogen economy as well, whether it's adding it to home heating or whether it's using it as a transportation fuel, that'll reduce emissions as well. So I think that the premiers are coming to the conclusion that there's different and better ways to reduce emissions, and it doesn't require things like carbon taxes.
Now, it seems to be another conclusion emerging has to do with the equalization program, because the criticism around that was not just one province, two provinces, it was several provinces expressing concerns around equalization. Is it time to have a First Ministers' Conference around that?
Yes, and if we can't get a First Ministers' Conference, of course the difference between this table is that this is just the Premiers. A First Ministers' Conference includes the Prime Minister. Barring that, I'd like to see our table come together and propose changes to equalization, because I don't think it was ever envisioned that a small population province like Newfoundland and Labrador would be a net payer and large population provinces like Ontario and Quebec would be net recipients like they were last year. That to me is just a fundamental problem with the formula. It's badly broken, because I think the idea behind it is that small population provinces may not have the resources in the tax base to be able to pay for the same level of services. We want to make sure there's continue to be supported, but I'm pretty hard pressed to think that Ontario and Quebec don't have the fiscal capacity. They should, and that's part of the conversation we need to have. We're over-equalizing certain provinces, and we're also not considering all of the sources of revenue that they have, and that's part of the reason why the formula is so broken. So if we can have that conversation at this table, and then maybe invite the Prime Minister in once we've come to some kind of consensus, that might be the best way forward.
Now, before we're done, I have to ask you, because, you know, the conference began with you raising a few eyebrows, because in the wake of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, you pointed to progressives criticizing conservatives too harshly, I guess is a way to put it, and that perhaps it was time to bring down that temperature. There was criticism of that comment. I'm wondering if that should have been a more broad comment from you, given how partisan things are, not only amongst politicians, but amongst Canadians.
Look, I think everybody was rattled and traumatized by what happened in the United States. Anyone who's in an elected position feels a vulnerability. There's no question about it. And I think that there is room to have robust disagreement on issues and to focus on the reasons why we have the disagreement on issues, but we should never make it personal. And when you start doing personal attacks and name calling, I think that that's when you end up seeing seeing the kind of polarization that we have. Look, I think we can all do better on this. I always try to find ways to stay focused on issues of disagreement, and I would hope that all members would do the same, because I think we've now seen just how terrible it can be when you end up with a polarization that causes the kind of outcome that we saw in the United States. It's not healthy to have that kind of disagreement. No one who's serving for public office should fear for their lives.
Premier Smith, I always appreciate the time. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.